There was a gentleman here in Virginia who was a contemporary and friend of both Jefferson and Madison. Historians refer to him as John Taylor of Caroline County, Virginia. In fact, that's where he's buried today. It was actually John Taylor that introduced the Virginia resolutions to the Virginia legislature because Jefferson and Madison, Jefferson had written the Kentucky resolutions, Madison had written the Virginia resolutions, and they were rather fearful about being arrested and perhaps thrown in prison for doing that. So it was actually John Taylor of Caroline that introduced the Virginia resolutions to the Virginia legislature. John Taylor, he wrote about checks and balances between the state and federal government. In Taylor's conception of checks and balances, the state and national governments must, they possess mutual vetoes. It is the federal government, if the federal government passed laws or rendered judgments over internal matters of states which state legislatures found contrary to their own state laws and constitutions, then they could declare them invalid in their states. To imagine something else makes the elaborate system of state and federal constitutions superfluous. Taylor wrote this: "Can it be imagined that the states, when forming a constitution and reserving a considerable share of political power to themselves, could have intended that the reservation be merely didactic and utterly devoid of the only means by which it could be preserved? Such a doctrine amounts to the insertion of the following article in the Constitution, subquote, Congress shall have power with the assent of the Supreme Court to exercise or usurp or to prohibit the states from exercising any and all powers reserved to the states whenever they shall deem it convenient or for the general welfare." Well, obviously they would not have gone to all the trouble of ratifying a constitution and setting up a form of government just to start practicing something totally different. Taylor insists that if the U.S. Constitution explicitly had declared a consolidated government, complete with the national and judicial supremacy later claimed to be implied in that document, none of the states would have ratified it in the first place. Can you imagine a state ratifying a constitution that we have in effect today? I doubt they would have done that. So where do we go from here? That's a good question. But you see, people choose political and economic systems based upon what they're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to accomplish prosperity, you choose laissez-faire capitalism. If you're trying to not assure prosperity, you might opt for communism or socialism. If you're trying to centralize government, you might opt for fascism or communism. We have to decide what form of government we're going to go forward with. And this is not going to be an easy decision, because if we decide to go back and put the bulwarks of liberty in place that our founders had originally put in place, it's going to take generations to do that. And it's going to be a fight. Ultimately, we're going to have to go back to being an entitlement society, to get away from being an entitlement society and go back to being an opportunity society. Another war that is going to have to be fought. Back in the early part of the 20th century, the progressives talked about the administrative state, that we needed to have an administrative state so that decisions were made by experts instead of people in the local communities. This administrative state is today what we call the federal bureaucracy. These people, much of what they do is nowhere authorized in the Constitution. And if those powers of government are, in fact, authorized at all, it's not for the federal level. It's for the state level. So can we once again say, we're free market capitalists, we believe in freedom, we understand that to accomplish those goals, that we have to relieve ourselves of the entitlement society and also get rid of the administrative state. My wife and I came here today from Parents' Weekend at Hampton-Sydney College. My son is a freshman there. Hampton-Sydney is kind of a unique place because not many colleges can say that Patrick Henry and James Madison were on their founding board of trustees. In fact, 6 of Patrick Henry's sons attended Hampton-Sydney. When we went there the first time to visit, my son asked the tour guide, he said, "Why is your college named after 2 Englishmen?" And the tour guide said, "Because when Hampton-Sydney was founded, there was no United States of America. We pre-exist the country." Well, the 2 Englishmen are John Hampden and Algernon Sidney. Historians call Algernon Sidney Sidney the Martyr. Now, the reason they call Sidney the Martyr is because Algernon Sidney wrote a book called Discourses on Government. The judge that Algernon Sidney was hauled before said, "This book you've written is a textbook." I don't know that he used the word textbook, but it's a description of how one foments revolution. It's a description of how one overthrows a king. So they made Sidney a martyr by cutting his head off by virtue of the fact that he had written that book. Ultimately, we may have to reread our Sidney. Ultimately, we have to go back and re-answer some pretty fundamental questions. Does a person have the right to defend himself from the initiation of force? Well, most of us would say yes. When the government deprives a person of his rights, using powers that the state has no constitutional authority to use, can that be defined as an initiation of force? Does a citizen have the right to protect himself from the initiation of force when the perpetrator is the government? These are questions that we may have to answer at one day, or perhaps we can do the easy thing and just get Andrew Napolitano to answer them as he's the next speaker. That's all I have to say. Make sure you tell him that I offered him up for that little chore. Thank you very much.